Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 169, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
And me, Ravi Abbott.
And welcome to the show. Now, I'm actually quite curious as to where people will be listening to the podcast this week, because, here in the UK at least, this is kind of the biggest weekend of the year. 4-day Easter bank holiday weekend.
It's starting to get sunny and, some people will be outside, but some will be inside playing computer games as well.
Or some will be doing both, like Ravi will have his shorts on, I'm sure, with his Game Boy in the park in the sunshine. And listen, we've got to say a big welcome if you are new to the podcast this week as well. I did spot on Twitter some really lovely tweets coming through of people going, I've just discovered your podcast this week, because we were actually featured in, and this was a little surprise to me, actually, because I knew it was coming, didn't know it was going to be this month, turning to page 12, I think it was, of the current issue of Retro Gamer, and seeing our ugly dweeby mugs.
Yeah.
Staring back.
It's awesome. So if you don't know about this show, we kind of cover the news in the first half, and then we get a guest on the show, and we've got over 168 shows that you can listen to, which is just crazy. And the guest that we have this week, oh my God, I've loved his channel since it kind of started, really. Well,
that's the thing about this show. I mean, you're right, we do cover so much. When we have developers on, we've had like CEOs of companies, Tom Kalinske from Sega, for example, was on. We've had people that made video games, but we do love having YouTubers on. Now, we've had, some of our favourites. LGR's been on this show, 8-Bit Guy, Retro Man Cave. And this week, it's a channel that we're both huge fans of. And this guy's got a really interesting history. He actually worked at a company that we covered recently on the podcast, actually, Sierra. And this is Metal Jesus Rocks.
Yeah, so you may know Metal Jesus Rocks because he also has a kind of crew of other YouTubers as well. So there's Reggie, there's Kenzie, there's Kelsey, there's quite a few of them. And he's also found the N64DD USA version, which was a kind of disk drive for the N64.
Yeah, this went viral, his video. Probably about 2 years ago that video came out now? And I know a lot of people probably discovered his channel then when he found this really ultra-rare Nintendo 64 prototype. Now, the American version never got released, so we've obviously got to talk about that. We're going to talk about his time at Sierra as well and what it was like, because he worked in so many different departments there. He started as an accountant, which, looking at him, he's a proper...
Very metal accountant, yeah.
He wouldn't really suit the role of an accountant, you wouldn't think, but, there's some great stories about his time there. Game collecting as well. I mean, there's videos he does about, insuring his game collections. He's got some really rare stuff.
Yeah, and he was even in a game himself, an FMV game, so we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, so we're really pleased to have him on. Jason from Metal Jesus Rocks is going to be our guest on the Retro Hour podcast in around 15 minutes from now. Now, also every week, we keep you up to date on the stories that have been happening in the world of retro gaming. We mentioned the Game Boy before, because I know you've actually been doing a bit of Game Boy modding that we'll talk about in a minute, but the Game Boy celebrated a big anniversary. It turned 30 this month, so we'll talk about that soon. And also, this mysterious Sonic the Hedgehog statue that's been discovered in the woods in Japan, that we've got a bit of an update on that story. Now, before we get into it, let's give a huge thank you to our loyal supporters. As, like we said at the start, this podcast does come out every Friday, and we've done this, we're into our 4th year of doing this show now, so we couldn't do this without your support. And if you'd like to make a little donation into the running of the show, that is massively appreciated. It helps us, keep it going, pay for all our costs, our studio time, editing, website hosting, all that kind of thing. And you will find your place in a future episode of the show on the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. Just like this week,
Ian Pointer,
Paul Woodling,
Steve Netting,
and Darren Coles, who all made donations into the running of the show. And if you're going to do the same, we accept it via PayPal. Any amount, it all goes back into the running of the podcast, and you'll find that link on our website at theretrohour.com. Now, while we're talking about amazing people who support the Retro Hour, let's give a big thank you to this episode's sponsor, and have been, helping out the Retro Hour all throughout April, and that is our amazing friends at RetroSoft Studios. Now, the podcast this month is brought to you by their brilliant new wrestling game. It's actually a retro wrestling game, as you'd expect from this show, called Retromania Wrestling. Now, the thing about their company is they do new games that are inspired by classics. So we all remember WrestleFest, that incredible arcade game back in the day. And you probably, Sam, I remember playing WWF WrestleFest, and had all those, great characters in there from WWF, like Hulk Hogan and Jake the Snake and $1 Million Man back in the day.
Yeah, and they've also kind of got, on this new version, still keeping to the original style of, 2D sprites and, those beautiful backgrounds that they have, but they're adding in new cool stuff. So they've got, local multiplayer, but you can have 8 players on that, which is quite good. So you get all your mates round, have a good wrestle.
Oh, well, you'd have dreamed of that when you were a kid. I mean, 2 players at the arcade seemed cool enough. But their new game, so Retromania Wrestling, it is a spiritual successor to the 1991 classic WrestleFest. And what's cool about this company is Mike Herman, who's the team lead on this. You know, I've had several conversations with Mike, lovely guy, but it was always his dream to make a sequel to the game that he loved so much as a kid. And now he's actually doing it. And there's so many, characters. We've announced a few over the last few weeks. Hawk and Animal of the Road Warriors, Tommy Dreamer, Austin Idol, Zack Sabre Jr. is going to be in the game too. Now, they are working on it at the moment, but we would love you. I mean, if you're on your phone right now or you're on your PC, open a new tab on your browser. Tap this in right now, retromaniawrestling.com. Just do that on your web browser. Have a little look at it. You'll be helping out the podcast. Check out the development of this game and how good it looks. And you can follow them on Twitter as well at RetroSoft Studio. I'll also put all that information in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, before we get into our chat with Metal Jesus Rocks, let's talk about the Game Boy's anniversary then. Because what a legendary system. I mean, the Game Boy really did change the world, didn't it?
Yeah, and it was, it was such a good system. Yeah. I think at one time, kind of, the Russian government were getting money from Tetris and then using that for the Cold War. It was a very big impact, but you remember how big Tetris was when it initially came out.
Yeah, and it was weird, because I remember my friend Sean actually got a Game Boy, probably 1990, and he brought it around. And at the time, I had a Commodore. And I remember looking at it thinking, oh, it's not that impressive. It's black and white graphics and the speaker doesn't sound all that great. But then we started playing Tetris and I'm like, okay, I'm hooked on this. I really want one of these now. That's the thing. It's a system that proved that power and specs weren't the most important thing.
Yeah, and it's definitely a grown-up boy now because it's 30 years old. Yeah. And I've been doing mods on it recently because a lot of you don't know that I do DJing with kind of old Amiga computers. Now, there's a whole Game Boy DJing scene, but also a modding scene with the original ones, and there's some really cool stuff you can do there. I've done one called the Pro Sound mod at the moment.
What's that then?
And it basically takes the sound directly off the board so that you don't have any kind of a little hum in there.
Well, the ground hum on the headphone jack.
And you can really, really blast it. But also you can do the screen mods on there as well. And there's these little kits on eBay. They're only about like 12, 15 quid.
Okay.
For a little screen mod for the original Game Boy, and then just take it apart, do a bit of soldering, and it's quite good fun, actually.
What are the new screens like, then?
It's weird, because on the new Game Boys, you can just put them in, but the old one, you have to literally, peel this foil off the back of it, and then, do a proper bit of modding, but there's plenty of YouTube videos out there. But it's great to see people still kind of 30 years later getting their Game Boys up to the latest kind of LCD display and stuff.
Because it's crazy. I mean, there was a really interesting handheld scene in the early 90s. I mean, we obviously had the Atari Lynx. I'm a big fan of the Lynx. The Game Gear, I've got one of those too. But the Game Boy, I was looking at some stats on it before. The Game Boy sold, well, let's actually do this the other way around. So the Game Gear sold 10 million units. Which, sounds all right for the time. Yeah. The Game Boy sold 118 million. So it was the clear winner of the handheld wars back in the early 90s. And I love it as well. I mean, it's a system that it kind of paved the way for everything that came after it. I mean, you look at the Nintendo Switch today, it's really just a superpowered Game Boy, isn't it?
And the kind of backwards compatibility that they kept with was really good. So, you could go all the way to the Game Boy Advance and still play original titles in it, which was really smart.
I love the fact that you're going to be doing DJing with Game Boys as well.
Yeah, so there's two pieces of software. One called Nano Loop, which is more kind of for people creating tunes, and then there's one which people have created tunes, but they're incredibly expensive, these cartridges, because they're drag and drop USB ones, and there was only a certain amount of them made.
Can you not get them on like Everdrives or something like that?
You can, but you can't fit so many tunes on them. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build a pitch control at the moment so I can change the tempo. So I could be playing Mario and go, woo.
Right, you're like a mad scientist with audio on old machines. So yeah, look forward to watching that on our Facebook page in coming months, I'm sure. But happy birthday, Game Boy, 30 years later and still an incredible machine. Now, one thing that, was really cool back in the early 90s and something that's kind of, been missing from games and consoles, and you still get them in arcades, but, it's not that common that you get them in the home anymore, and that is light gun games.
Yeah, I've missed light gun games so much, and, they never really had a good modern solution for it. So they had the aim track. I don't know if you've ever used that.
Was that the thing with, like, the Wii kind of sensor bar?
It had a Wii sensor bar at the top, but it was a lot more accurate than the kind of Wii. So, the Wii one, it feels a bit kind of wobbly, doesn't it? And it's not really fully tight and controlled like the other one. This felt a bit better, but now there's a completely new piece of technology that's come out, and it's just been a Kickstarter. I think it was only released 3 days ago, and they've already doubled their goal on the Kickstarter. So there's a big demand for this, and this is called the Sinden Light Gun.
The Sinden Light Gun. Now, Retro Man Cave actually did a video with the guy who's behind this. Which I'll link up in our show notes because it is a really good watch, actually. And that maybe, we should probably get him on the podcast at some point in the future as well because it looks really cool. But what it is, I mean, it's a new light gun for 2019 that lets you play, via emulation. You can play stuff like Duck Hunt, Wild Gunman, Mad Dog McCree, which, I remember that in the arcade.
Yeah,
that was also love. Virtua Cop, House of the Dead, Time Crisis, all these games. Because for people who might not know, people might be listening and going, well, why can't you play those anymore at home? Because the way these old classic light guns worked, they tracked the beams on CRT TVs. So you need a big old school TV to use them on.
A good high refresh rate as well. That was the thing that you needed.
So it means now, even via emulation and stuff, you can't use these old school light guns on modern TVs. But it uses completely new technology to allow you to do it.
Yeah, it's got this custom board in there, and then it's got this camera that basically detects any monitor, kind of rectangular monitor, and then finds the center of it. And then there's a little computer in there that does calculations to work out the exact positioning. So there's no calibration, but also you can do it from multiple angles in the room. Which is crazy. And he's talking about, recoil action on this. It's got a lovely little reload on it. And also they have a 2-player thing. But I think these are going to be pretty hard to get hold of until he can get some kind of mass production thing. Because judging by this demand, they're already all sold out.
Watching that video, I think it surprised him, the demand for it.
Yeah.
It works with a modern PC, so it's USB interface, or it works with the Raspberry Pi as well. But he's also said, he couldn't really resist doing some new stuff with it too. He's also got experimental 3D tracking.
That sounded very interesting. So it was like when you moved with the gun, the picture may move at the same time or something like that. This could be a whole new interface, couldn't it?
And I've watched the videos on it, and actually I didn't realise how much I would love to play light gun games again at home. Because I've got in my living room, I've got a 65-inch, TV. It would be great to stand there with a gun and playing these awesome old school games. And via emulation, especially on a PC, you can pretty much play anything. And he said there are games that that do work with it. PC games that are out there that you can use it with. So I think it does kind of do some mouse kind of emulation, so you can use it with games that are not built for it. But it looks really cool. So if you want to back this Kickstarter, there is still a couple of weeks left on it. I'll put it in our show notes at theretrohour.com. And just imagine you're on holiday in Japan. You might be going out hiking for the day. Have a little ramble through the woods. And all of a sudden you turn round and there is a giant Sonic the Hedgehog statue from the early 90s, just randomly in the middle of nowhere.
On a snowboard.
Yeah, of all things. Now, this exists, and there have been videos and kind of pictures and stuff surfacing about this over, probably the last year or so, I think it was discovered, wasn't it?
Yeah, so if you look at a YouTuber called Badnik Mechanic, he's got the whole kind of mystery of the Sonic statue series on there, and this is crazy. So years ago, somebody found a random Sonic statue in the woods of Japan. Now, this is a huge statue, and he's doing a massive snowboarding kind of grab on there.
And it looks like Sonic from the early 90s, a design, isn't it?
Yeah. So people have put this up on a forum. Where is this? And they all couldn't find it. Then a guy had motorbiked through this area of Japan, and he said, I saw it, but I can't remember where it was because I motorbiked. So all these guys on the Sonic forum sat there using Google Maps, Street View.
Right.
Going through this whole area of woods until one guy found the location of it, which is really interesting. He's kept that secret, so there's a pact between these guys. They're like protectors of the Sonic statue. So that anybody who goes out there, they can kind of say, where's the Sonic statue? And these guys will go, it's over here. So they sent another guy out to kind of seek permission. Now, the Japanese media started to get interested in this, and they've started to do some research recently where they went and they obviously had an advantage being able to talk Japanese and talk to a lot more people, and they found out that actually the guy who owned it was from one of the old Sega worlds in Japan.
So it was the theme park?
Yeah,
okay.
He was the manager of it, and they had this giant snowboarding Sonic bursting out the top. He'd bought a house in the woods, and no one could find the entrance to his house. So he'd be like, come to my house, and I can't find it. So he goes, all right, I'll just put a big Sonic in the woods and then just go left at the Sonic.
That's insane. So he worked at the theme park, took it home, and just used it as like, I'll put that out there. That'll work. That'll be unique.
Yeah. But it was one of these kind of like unsolved mysteries of the Sonic statue. And now they're talking about possibly his family getting together and repainting it and kind of preserving it, because even people of the area didn't know about this huge Sonic statue.
And that's the thing. So, I mean, I imagine by the design of it and the fact that it was Sega World, it would have been probably, mid-90s, I guess, probably when it was on display. But yeah, I mean, it's been out in the elements for like 20-odd years. So it is looking a bit worn at the moment, isn't it? But it would be great if they restored it.
Yeah, because, Sega have been tweeting about it and stuff, so...
There is one at Alton Towers. Have you been on the Sonic ride there? And they've got it's a more like early 2000s Sonic, a big statue of him stood there.
Was it like Sonic Spinball or something like that?
I think it was like Sonic Adventure era, but yeah, the game is. The game is still... Well, the ride's still there. But yeah, every time I go there, I always have to get my picture taken with Sonic. Maybe I might ask Alton Towers if I can buy it off them, so... Probably couldn't afford it, but there's a dream there.
Have that to show where your house is.
Yeah, show me the end of my road. Just turn right at the big Sonic I nicked from Alton Towers. So if you don't check out the pictures of it, honestly, it's really, really cool. I'll stick that in the show notes too. Now, before we chat to Metal Jesus, let's talk about something really random from Apple. Obviously, we're all on Apple today. The iPhone and the iPad, some of the biggest handheld computers in the world, and even going back to the early 90s. I remember even though in hindsight it was problematic, I remember being wowed the first time I saw an Apple Newton. That was their PDA, wasn't it, back in the early 90s?
Yeah, and that was all kind of during the Scully period, wasn't it? And a lot of things came from there as well. So like stuff like emojis that we have now, and a lot of research that was held at that group came to light. But also there was a lot of things that weren't very successful, and the Newton was definitely one.
Yeah, first thing Steve Jobs killed when he came back to Apple, I think, wasn't it? But there was also another system they were working on around the time the Newton came out in 1993 called the Walt.
The Walt.
Now, this was... it looks really, really cool, actually, the design of it. It's a little bit wacky looking. It stands for Wizzy Active Lifestyle Telephone. So this was a touchscreen telephone in 1993 by Apple.
Looks a bit bigger than your iPhone, doesn't it?
It's bigger than an iPad Pro by the looks of this thing. It's massive. But what it is, it's really a Mac that's been shrunk down into a tablet form from the early 90s. Now, it runs full-on Mac System 6 by the looks of it. It's got a touchscreen on there that you can use with a stylus. It's got a fax machine built into it. It's got on-display caller ID. It's got a phone built in there as well, customizable ringtones, online banking access, and a built-in address book too. Now, there is a video that's just surfaced, because people have talked about these for years, but there is now a video on YouTube where you can watch it being demoed.
I just love the fact it's got a fax machine in there. That's so good.
Really ties it to the era of that, doesn't it? Sitting there on the train faxing from it, yeah. You look at it and it's very much of its time. It's got like a spinning hard disk in there. You turn this thing on, it takes 2 minutes to boot.
The kind of curves on it do remind me a bit of the Pippin.
Yeah.
It's got that kind of design.
And some of the Mac kind of monitors of the era looked a bit like that too. And they actually got like when this guy bought it, the prototype, there's like a manual with it with some really like weird things in there. Apple kind of give it like a personality. Do not use Walt near water. Do not drop Walt like it's a person. You know what I mean? But you remember that time, they were kind of giving computers and operating systems personalities. Yeah. Microsoft Bob, do you remember? Like, it was like
very strange.
User-friendly and everything as well.
But
so
it's really interesting to see where all this stuff kind of came from, because it is just a Mac shoved into a plastic case.
Which everyone, when the iPad came out, everyone thought it was going to be that, didn't they? But as it turned out, just shoving a computer into a tablet and giving you a stylus, it didn't actually work all that well, so they had to kind of build the operating system from the ground up. But it's a really interesting look back at Apple's development, more than 25 years ago now. And, this is really the father of the iPad and the iPhone and everything,
I've got a question. Would you do your online banking on the Walt?
If I could connect to my online banking, I'd be amazed from that. I don't think it'll have SSL and everything on it, but if I could, I definitely would. Absolutely. Right, now, before we get into our chat with Metal Jesus, just a quick reminder, do check out our friends at Retromania Wrestling from Retrosoft Studios. I'll put a link in our show notes. You've got to check them out as well. It's this game that's been inspired by the old 1991 arcade game WrestleFest, and they are supporting the Retro Hour podcast this week. Like we were talking about before, pick up and play arcade wrestling action. Taking you back to the early 90s, gorgeous 2D graphics on there as well. It's even got stuff like ring entrances with entrance music that I know you were like really impressed at when we saw these demos.
Oh, yeah, I love that. I remember it. That's all I'd do in the 90s. I'd make ring entrances and just sit there laughing at the worst, like, you know, the really beefy guys with really girly music. Or
well, there is entrance music in this as well. There's multiple entrance attires for each wrestler as well. So, I mean, you know, they've really done a great job on this. The game's not released yet, but you can get a look at its development and support the Retro Hour podcast and keep an eye on the features. So, as I said, open your browser, type in retromaniawrestling.com. Do that right now, or follow them on Twitter at Retrosoft Studio. Right then, let's get into our chat all about the history of Sierra, picking up on that episode that we did a couple of weeks ago with someone who actually worked there during their peak, and also his incredible YouTube channel, collecting games, and lots more as well, with this week's special guest, Jason from Metal Jesus Rocks. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is our pleasure to welcome on this week's very special guest. Now, Ravi and I are huge fans of the YouTube channel Metal Jesus Rocks, and it's our pleasure to welcome to the show the man behind it. Hello, Jason.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you very much for having me on your awesome podcast.
Yeah, it's great to have you on now. We're going to get into, obviously, I mean, you worked at Sierra, which we actually did a whole episode about Sierra recently, so it'll be great to talk to you and get some of your stories about your time at the company, and also your amazing YouTube channel as well. But I mean, kind of going back to, you know, your earliest days, what kind of first got you into video games?
Well, I don't know if you know this about me, but I am old. And so I'm old school. And two things, really. The arcades back in the probably early 80s is, you know, I mean, I'm talking about the classics. I'm talking about Frogger and, you know, Pac-Man. And I remember seeing a Space Invaders machine for the first time, you know, probably at a pizza joint, stuff like that. So that was really exciting. But my parents bought me an Atari 2600. And I remember I had like Combat, I think, and stuff like that, you know. So it was just magic, you know what I mean? It was just that time of my life where I was just young enough to where it just felt like magic. And so that's where that all started. But I got to tell you, though, as passionate as I was about the Atari, it wasn't really until the Commodore 64 that I suddenly was like, this is everything that I want to do. This is everything that I love. And that was definitely the Commodore 64.
So you were kind of more of a computer guy then?
Yeah. It's funny you say that because I turned into it, but I don't know if there's any real reason for that. I guess, you know, it's funny because people talk about how there was in the United States a video game crash that happened in I think 1984. And I never felt it as a gamer and as a fan of video games, because essentially what happened was I had an Atari 2600, and I remember that the games were kind of getting crappy around that time. And I had a friend of mine, a neighbor, who had a TI 99, I think is what it was. It's, you know, a computer. And it wasn't a great computer, but it introduced me to the world of computers. And then I got introduced to the Commodore 64, and that's where I was like, oh, wow, these games can be awesome. You know, it felt like a generational leap beyond the Atari and sort of the home consoles, because things on floppy disk could have, I remember specifically like games had stories, and, you know, like role-playing games for the first time, games that weren't just quarter munchers, but they were games where you could sink days, weeks, months into, you know. And so that was really the appeal of the Commodore and computer games for sure.
And I love that about your channel as well, the fact that you do cover the C64, because I mean, a lot of, you know, YouTube channels that you see only cover like kind of the consoles. But I mean, I remember, you know, you've done like your favourite Commodore 64 games, and there was the even the iPad versus C64 video as well that I did like, and you've covered the C64 Mini in recent years too. So it is great that you do cover the computer side of it too.
Yeah, I found on my YouTube channel that actually I do have a certain level of success with videos that do cover computer games. It's funny because, especially with the Metal Jesus crew, you know, the friends of mine that come on my channel, that I think all of them would say that they're not computer gamers, yet so many people remember playing computer games back when they're younger. Like it was their parents' computer, and they would have some educational games like Oregon Trail or something like that. So I would love to do more of that. It's funny because I'm actually working on a computer video right now, and it's funny because I was last night working on this video, and suddenly the computers decided to stop working. And they're so fragile, they're so I understand that the appeal of people who want to see videos of that, because there's like, man, to try to get this to work, in 2019 is kind of a pain in the butt sometimes. So, but I'm more than happy to take that challenge on.
And computers were like really big here in the UK. I remember at school, it was all like Acorn machines and Commodore and Spectrums and Amstrads and stuff, more so than consoles really in the 80s.
Yeah. It's hard to say here in the US. I think it was, again, to me, maybe because I was a little bit outside of it, but, all my friends in junior high had Commodore 64s, or the rich kids had Amigas, you know what I mean? Or maybe somebody had an Atari ST, and ooh, what's that? That sounds so exotic, it's an Atari computer. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to know what the mix is, because it felt to me like it was leaning more towards computers. But then when I started collecting for consoles, I started realizing, like, wow, actually, it seems like more people definitely had consoles. I had consoles. Like I remember having an original Nintendo, the entertainment system. And then I also had the Super NES, but they just didn't get the love of my computer, back in the day. So.
Have you always lived in Seattle, and kind of what was the game scene like with so many companies around?
So I have. So I'm born and raised in what they call the Puget Sound area. And that's a really tough one for me to know, because I actually lived in really small towns. I'm talking towns that had 3,000 people in them sometimes. And so Nintendo of America is in the Seattle area, but they were, I think in the 80s, they were probably the only one, right? Because there wasn't any Microsoft yet, really. Certainly no Sony. Now, what I would say, though, that has completely changed today. Today, we have almost everyone here in the Seattle area. So today we have 300 video game companies at least, and we have, everyone from Nintendo. Obviously, Microsoft isn't, here. Sony has developers here. Apple just bought an entire city block, and they're jumping into gaming here. Plus, EA is here. EA's been here EA has a branch here that's been here for a long time, because they own Big Fish and a bunch of those mobile games and stuff like that. Amazon is obviously here in Seattle, and Amazon is big into games as well. So to answer your question, in the 80s, I don't think there was a huge gaming scene here per se. I was probably definitely leaning more towards maybe the UK. You guys obviously had a huge scene on computers.
Yeah.
And in Japan, but today I tell people we have 11 retro gaming stores in the Seattle area.
No way.
And people don't believe it. And it's like, and by the way, that's just retro gaming stores. That doesn't count all the GameStops. It doesn't count all the pawns, the pawn stores. I think what you guys would call charity shops. It's immense here.
So you entered Sierra on a really strange route, which was kind of through accounting. How did that work then? Yeah.
So I mentioned, Commodore 64, and I loved programming BASIC on it. And so, when I graduated high school, I thought, I'm just going to become a programmer. That sounds awesome. And so I went to a local technical school called Renton Votech, and to learn programming. And that was an 8-hour day of schooling to learn how to program. But in 1989, 1990, if you wanted to get a job programming, the number one thing that you would get hired for was accounting. And so you could learn to program, and that's great, but you're going to get a job in accounting. And the reason for that is because this is before Windows and Excel had really taken off, right? So it's a little bit before that time. So a lot of big corporations would hire programmers to program AS400s, these big server mainframes, or maybe you'd go to a bank and program the stuff that they need or whatever. Every company that was of a certain size needed accounting people. And so I reluctantly went there to learn programming, but also every single day I had an hour or two of accounting. And it turns out, actually, I was pretty good at it. I captured, I was able to understand it fairly quickly. I wouldn't say I'm great with numbers, but I took to it well. And so, after going for a couple of years and learning accounting, so what happened was that, but I never really intended to get that job. Actually, at the time I was doing it, I was actually working in a bar. I was actually helping mix drinks and stuff like that. But I opened up the newspaper one day, and there was a job posted by Sierra, and they had their logo on there, and they're looking for accounting people. I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Well, I could do that. I mean, at the time, I tell people I would have, if that would have been a janitor job, I would have took it. If cleaning floors, I would have took it. Now, at the time, so the story is that what happened was I was living with another bartender who had kind of stupid amounts of money, and he bought a color scanner and color printer, which at that time was very expensive. Most people did not have that. And so what I did was I pulled out one of my King's Quest boxes, probably, scanned the Sierra logo, and then using, I think, Corel Draw or Corel Paint or something like that, printed up my resume with the Sierra logo huge in the background that was kind of faded. It was almost like it was printed on their letterhead. And I also printed the letter that I was mailing to them with my resume in there, and I had the official Sierra logo on it. And I sent it off to them, and literally just like, it was a day or less than a day later, they called me. They're like, "Who are you?" Because I think they actually thought that maybe I was pulling their leg or I already worked there. So anyway, so they're like, "Well, hey, you got to come in and interview." And so I went there, and so what had happened was Sierra had moved their corporate headquarters from Oakhurst, California, up to the Seattle area. It's technically Bellevue/Victoria. It's like 20 minutes or so from where I live today. And, the reason why they did that is because Ken Williams was having a hard time hiring people to move to such a small little California town. And so they were growing so much, they decided to move their corporate headquarters up to our area. Anyways, to make a long story short, I go there to get an interview, and I'm like the only person there. Like, it's like 3 or 4 accounting people. So what they'd done is they'd only moved the accounting department or accounting people so far. Everyone else was still down in California. So I go to this massive building, and it's almost completely empty. And there's basically just a guy named Jeff Bianchi who's running around installing Ethernet cables. They didn't even have like computer tables set up. It was literally just office space that was mostly empty, except for the accounting department. And so it was really weird. I was like, okay. So anyways, I got that job. And then slowly over the next year, they started filling that building up with, Al Lowe's team and educational people. There was a company called Brightstar that they brought in, and slowly the entire corporate machine filled up. But I was definitely on the ground floor when I moved up here.
Well, no, after that, you kind of moved into customer support, didn't you, from accounting? And what kind of calls were you dealing with? And was there any kind of odd calls that you kind of remember from that era?
Yeah. So, what happened was that I remember my manager in accounting, she's like, I would come to work, again, picture accounting people, right? They're usually fairly conservative and, buttoned up people. And I would come in with rock T-shirts and, a tan and shorts, and she just knew. She knew it was like, hey, you're not going to stay here forever. And she actually encouraged me. She's like, listen, it's a growing company. Why don't you see where else you might fit and go from there. And from the accounting department into the kitchen, where you get your food and your drinks and stuff, I would always pass through the technical support customer service department, and I immediately knew. These are my people, like, the people with the funky colored hair, and they've got a bunch of Star Wars figures on their desks, and, they're playing music and stuff. I was like, oh yeah, this is my next step. And so what I ended up doing was, because I was technical, I skipped right to a lead position, basically, kind of like they had, all these tiers or whatever. So I didn't have to kind of come in at the ground level. And so I immediately kind of went in there. And basically what I did is that because I really love Dynamics and their games, I focused on them. They called it the simulation games, but that included everything from football, American football, to baseball, and then all the dynamic stuff. So Aces over Europe, Red Baron, anything that would have some, like Papyrus games, they're racing games and stuff like that. And they were also the most challenging to get working too, because they usually required a lot of conventional memory. They were very tricky to get working. And I was very good at being on the phone with people, trying to make boot discs, something back that you had to do back in the day. I will say, though, that while I ended up in customer service, the cool thing about Sierra at the time is that they still tapped into everyone. It was still a small enough company that even though you were on the phones answering questions, they would tap into us to write articles for Interaction magazine. We were right next to the marketing department, so the marketing department would come over here because marketing people typically aren't gamers, and so they'd come over to my desk and be like, "Hey, what do you think about this box? What do you think about this art? Is this something that you would catch your eye if it was on the shelf of a CompUSA and stuff like that?" And so a lot of that, I got to meet the musicians that were writing the music for games and stuff like that. It was really cool.
I was wondering, did you play any Sierra games in your spare time? Because they say like if you work in McDonald's, then you get sick of McDonald's. So,
yeah.
Were you playing when you got home?
Yes. It's funny though because I had a bit of a reputation at Sierra for being the guy who, at 5:05 at night, I would be halfway out the parking lot and driving home. Like I didn't really I was very, very reluctant to stay behind and play games because I had a computer at home. And so to answer your question is that a lot of people at Sierra were encouraged to stay after work and play games. And I don't know, part of me is like, nah, I can just go home and crack a beer and play my games. And so, yes, I mean, absolutely. I've always had a kind of computer, but I remember that Sierra at the time realized that a lot of their employees didn't have computers at home. And so they did this basic thing where they would loan you the money to buy a computer and then you could pay it off with your paycheck. And so that's exactly what I did. I bought a Micron, I think Pentium 100 at the time, top of the line, probably cost me $3,000 or something like that, and had it at home. And I've always been, I definitely played a lot of Sierra games, but I also played a lot of LucasArts, pretty much everything. I've always been someone who, would go home and I'd play everything that came out at the time. I remember playing MechWarrior 2 from Activision and all that stuff. It was awesome.
What were your favorite Sierra titles then?
Yeah, so, I get asked this question and everyone wants me to say the King's Quest and the Space Quest and all that sort of stuff. And I do like those games, except for I get stuck in them. I don't know if I'm not smart enough to figure out the puzzles I will say that Sierra had some really nasty puzzles. You know what I mean? Like I never got the whole thing where in order to solve this one puzzle, you've got to go over here and you've got to pick up a chicken and then maybe got to, tape a bottle rocket to its back. And then you know what I mean? It's like these crazy ass puzzles that I don't even know how people figured them out. So to answer your question, my favorite developer by far was Dynamics. I loved everything that they did, everything from The Incredible Machine to like the simulation games. Like I loved Aces over Europe, Ace of the Pacific, Red Baron, A-10 Tank Killer. I at the time it was a bunch of flight sims, and so I was really big into that. And Dynamics made some of the most fun ones that you could play. But I also loved their other stuff. Like they made Stellar 7 and they made the original MechWarrior for Activision. And they also made, and also too, I really did like their adventure games. So they made The Adventures of Willie Beamish, which I thought was a really cool, quirky adventure game. They made Rise of the Dragon, which was a Blade Runner-esque, adventure game. So I kind of dug those. So I love those guys. They were awesome.
I think you made a really interesting point there as well about the, how difficult and like illogical some of the puzzles were in games of that era. I mean, I was chatting today with a friend on Facebook and we were reminiscing about a game, I think Core Design released it, called Universe. That was a gorgeous adventure game, but I remember being so frustrated and never making it off like the first level of it because the puzzles were so illogical until I got like a magazine walkthrough, but it was the only way to solve them. But I guess maybe just, maybe it was a way to elongate the games to players, or they just hadn't figured out design. I'm not sure.
I know for Sierra, a lot of these games were made in a bubble. In other words, you'd have a designer like Al Lowe or Roberta Williams. And for the most part, it seemed like they made them themselves, and they didn't really bring in outside beta testers or play testers like you would today. Today games are so expensive that most developers at a certain point, they bring in the public, whether it's a public beta or private beta, or they bring in friends, family, and media to test out stuff to see where do people get stuck. Is this working? I think back then that just didn't happen. I will say, though, that I think probably some of my favorite adventure games were actually LucasArts. There was something about Full Throttle and some of those games that just seemed a little bit more, I was able to understand them or get through them easier.
Well, I mean, talking about that as well, you did move into games testing at Sierra too. I mean, was that one of the things that you were kind of looking at, how players would see the game? Yeah,
that's a good point, is that I did a lot of testing as well. And so, and that comes from being technical as well. Testing back then was really interesting because it helped to be technical because not everyone was. But you also have to think like the customer, and I'm very good at that. And actually, even beyond Sierra, when I moved into other software companies, I've always been the guy who will think like a customer, and so they definitely used me for that. And again, specifically with Dynamics games, they would be like, I remember very vividly being brought a copy. I think it was Earth Siege 2 or something like that, and it was a gold. It wasn't the Gold Master, but it was definitely beta. It was like, okay, we're going to ship this game in 2 weeks. I'm like, okay. They just want me to run through it, make sure that there's nothing obvious, right? And I would be the one who would hit the escape key at the wrong time and crash the game. But I remember the developer telling me that it needed an outrageous amount of memory on PCs. And I've told this story before, and I always forget the exact amount. But he brings me the disc, and he's like, yeah, just make sure that you have 32 megs of RAM or something like that. And I was like, and at the time I remember thinking only Bill Gates has enough money to have that much RAM.
It wasn't cheap back then, was it, RAM?
Yeah, exactly. And I remember, I think I had 4 or 8 megs, and that was considered what most people would have. Right. And I remember just telling them, like, dude, nobody's going to be able to run this. And it sucks. You have to be very careful when you do that, because essentially when you tell somebody that, they have to go, oh, because do they now extend the ship date by 2 weeks or a month to try to optimize the game and the art assets to try to fit into a machine that, small, right? With that little of RAM. So it's a very, you end up being the guy who gives people bad news. So I think a lot of people who want to go into testing thinking, oh, it'd be fun to play games all day. Well, actually what you're doing is you're telling somebody that, hey, what you did doesn't work or is broken, you know what I mean? Or isn't going to sell. I've had to do that many times during my career, and it's never fun, but it's a trust thing. And so that was one of those moments where he looked at me and was like, oh man, well, this isn't going to sell. It was really interesting.
With Sierra, I remember them doing kind of FMV titles, and when they started to move on to 3D, that was where it started to go a bit wrong. And that was the case with many companies, actually, like Sensible Software and stuff like that. Did you kind of wince a bit at those early 3D titles?
Well, so back then, Ken Williams was always very forward-looking. And actually, I listened to your podcast about Sierra, and it was really interesting, that guy who's writing that book, because he nails it on the head, is that, Ken's a technology guy, but more than that, he also understands, he was very clear that games were going to be more than just games. We'd get these emails, and the marketing department especially talked about this, is that, the way that Sierra thought about the price of games was based on movies. So, at the time you might pay $10 for, of course, it's probably not quite that much, but let's just say it was $10 to go to a 2-hour movie. Well, that is a $5 an hour entertainment value, right? Yeah. You're willing to spend $5 for, every hour of entertainment when you go to the movies. And so Sierra thought about the same way about their video games and the prices and the amount of entertainment you would get out of that. And because of that thinking, naturally led to making games more like movies. Obviously the technology was starting to move that direction with CDs and then later on DVDs, but also the processing power to do videos that had actually a decent frame rate and decent resolution. And also to Myst, the game Myst, when that came out in the US, that was a mega seller. And it really changed how Sierra thought about their bread and butter, because here's this game that just, it came on CD. You had to have a CD-ROM to play it. It had this CD audio. I mean, it wasn't full motion video, but it was, I have to imagine Sierra was like, oh man, like this is the future, everyone's going to have a CD-ROM very soon. So let's go ahead and move into full motion video. And to answer your question, did it make you wince? It's funny you say that, because at the time it seemed like the future, and then it didn't. And for the longest time after Sierra, I thought that full motion games were just a joke. And there was only a handful of really good ones. Like I think we can argue that Wing Commander 3, Wing Commander 4 are great examples of full motion video games, right? Because the cutscenes are full motion video, but there's still a game there. We've always said that Gabriel Knight 2 is one of the better examples of a full motion video game because it didn't sacrifice too much of the gameplay element, even though it was kind of annoying to have to wait for Gabriel to stand still and walk over to a table and stuff like that. But but for the longest time, full motion video games were just universally terrible, or unnecessary, I should say. And so anyways, after leaving Sierra, I was like, oh man, that was a dark period of gaming. But it's funny, you've probably seen this too, is that now gamers of a certain age are kind of coming around and sort of being nostalgic towards them, which I find really interesting. So
yeah, I mean, we've even seen it had a bit of a resurgence in recent years, and obviously now you can do it like, beautiful 4K film sequences and everything.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, the whole problem with full motion video is just that, it's like a movie. It's like, it's hard to make movies that are good because you have to get the right lighting, the right actor, the right script, and all this stuff. It's so much easier, in my opinion, to just sculpt a great animated cutscene, right? Where you can make it exactly the way you want instead of having to rely on all the full motion video stuff. And so I think that's why it's tough. It's tough to make good movies. It's tough to make good full motion video games, but there are some examples of it, for sure.
Yeah, you're completely right, because kind of if you have one bad actor in an FMV film, that can ruin the whole experience, even with amazing sets and a whole amazing cast,
Oh, but back in the day, they'd use like people from The Office to be actors in the games and stuff, wouldn't they? A lot of the time in FMV sequences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm living proof of that, right? It's like they'll put me in a game. I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, they did that an awful lot. And it's funny too, because Phantasmagoria in your previous podcast, they're talking about how that was the best-selling Sierra game, and that's probably true. But it was such a tough shoot. A friend of mine who now works at Valve was involved in that, and it was just a nightmare to make Phantasmagoria. So much so that basically they just wrapped it up. And the reason, I don't know if you've ever played the ending of Phantasmagoria, but it just ends. She just walks away because they were done. They just had to get that thing out. They'd spent way too much time, way too much money. Let's just get this sucker out. And that's why, oh man, the ending is just bad. It's just so bad.
Well, talking about your YouTube channel, I mean, I remember one of may have even been the first video that you did was the Atari 2600 game from Activision, Hero. I mean, was that one of your fondest titles when you were younger, that game?
Yeah, I really loved Hero. And Hero is, at the time I didn't realize it was anything special. I guess it's from a collecting standpoint, right? It just was a really cool game on the Atari 2600. People forget that the Atari 2600 was originally made to be a clone. It was made to kind of play tennis games.
Yeah.
It was never meant to do a bunch of sprites on the screen. It was never meant to do levels or, all this sort of stuff that they ended up doing with it. And so there weren't a lot of platforming games on the Atari because it was just so hard to do. You have Pitfall 2, and, a handful of others. But Hero, to me, at the time, was just so awesome. And I still think it's a really good game today, although I look at it through the eyes of some people who try to play it new, and they're frustrated with the physics that go into that game. But for me, man, it's like my Mario. It's like my Super Mario Brothers. When I plug it in Atari and I hold that joystick and I play Hero, yeah, I'm back as a kid. It's awesome.
Well, what I really like about your channel is you kind of discuss the wider aspects of collecting. A lot of people will have a YouTube video which will be my collection and stuff, but they won't talk about stuff like insuring games or even your damp in the basement stuff that you had recently. Are you planning any more of these kind of wider collecting videos?
Yeah, I've always looked at collecting as a very broad thing. I mean, it's, of course, see, I collect more than just games. I'm also a music collector as well. And as much as I'm into games, I'm actually probably as much, if not more so, into music. And I've always been into both my entire life. And so, it's so interesting because I think because games is newer, I think people are surprised by some of the stuff. But if you were to say, oh, you're going to insure your record collection or your guitar collection or whatever sort of collection, it's just a natural. But for games, people are like, oh, I thought these were for kids. And, games, it's all new, for some people. And so for me and my YouTube channel, I just like covering stuff that I think, should be talked about. So for instance, today I released a video that's all about misprints, like cover art that is misprinted. So recently Darksiders in the US on the Switch, basically THQ forgot to put the red spine on there. They basically sent it off to the printing presses, and it arrived in the US and it has a black spine with like the art kind of leaning over onto the spine. It looks really weird. And I was like, let's do a video about collecting these kind of misprinted screw ups sometimes, because again, and in the video, I talk about how over in the music world, this has been happening for 50 years. Mm. You have Kiss albums and Def Leppard albums and Beatles albums that have misprints and they sell for $10,000 sometimes, That's why I do that sort of stuff. Although to say, I've never wanted to come across as an expert or know-it-all in gaming either. One of the pieces of feedback I kind of get sometimes is that, oh man, he doesn't know everything about Nintendo, or, he doesn't know everything about Sega. And I want to be very clear. I never meant to. It's too hard. Again, getting back to music, nobody knows everything about music or movies or art, And so that's why I have people on my YouTube channel that I can bring in, like the John Hancocks, who have complete collections of everything, to be experts and kind of bounce that sort of stuff off of. It's fun. It adds variety.
That's one thing on YouTube. People will always pick you up if you make even the tiniest little mistake, won't they, as well?
Yeah, I know. It's true. I know. It's like I'd love to be able to re-upload my videos sometimes because, it's funny, too, because I'll think something and say the opposite, or, you know what I mean? And I don't even pick it up. Like I did a video on, I think it was the Wii U or the Wii or something like that, but I kept saying GameCube in the video. I'm like, oh, and I didn't realize it, until it's uploaded. I'm like, what? Oh man.
Well, speaking about your collection, I mean, which kind of way around did it work? I mean, did you start your YouTube channel, then your collection kind of came out of that, or did you have a big collection and think, let's make videos about this stuff that I've got?
Well, I've always been collecting, like I said, a little bit of video games and a little bit of music, well, a lot of music. I had a huge big box PC game up until, I don't know, probably 2005 or 2004. It's one of those things where I just threw it all away like a moron. You know what I mean? This is worthless. Let me just toss this in the garbage. And, and then, of course, years later, I'm like, oh, wow, I can't find a copy of that anywhere. That sucks. I had that, It's funny because back on the Commodore 64, I had thousands of games, but they were all pirated. Yeah. You know what I mean? I was like, it's amazing. I got all these, but it's not because I didn't want to buy them. I was a kid, right? Yeah. And you find some guy who's got 2 disk drives and, has these discs. So that's why I love collecting the physical thing now, because I never felt like when I was a kid, I was actually owning all those games. You know what I mean? And it's cool to have that stuff in my collection, to have it physical. And so, but that said, I've always had like a really large CD collection of music. I've always had some vinyl records and things like that. And I've always had a decent amount of video games, for sure.
Well, I read in one interview that you'd met a lady who was burning her old video games.
Oh man, yeah. Well, so I'm sure you've heard of Craigslist over here. It's it's a public bulletin board system that anyone can post anything on there. And I used to be on that a lot, just looking for stuff or keywords. And I forget what the search term I came up with, but when you're on sites like that long enough, you start to notice that, hey, this person might have more than just what they're advertising, because as we've mentioned, some people think video games are worthless, right? They're for kids, for whatever reason, they just think that they, like you'll go to a garage sale and they'll have all these tools and clothes and all this stuff out on the lawn. And then you ask them if they have video games. They're like, oh yeah, we got some, some in the basement if you want. They don't even think they're worth anything. They think they're toys. Anyways, and so, yeah, I saw a search, and I forget what it was. I wish I could remember. Let's put it this way: it was really far away from my house. It was like, I think I had to drive an hour and a half, but I knew that this person probably would have more than they said. So anyways, I drive all this way. I do bring a little bit of extra cash with me just in case. I get to their house, and it's kind of like a trailer park, which is, a mobile home. And it's kind of dirty inside. And, I was kind of wondering if I was going to like lose a kidney and, wake up a week later and have my head shaved. But they were burning the boxes and the manuals and basically anything that was paper from all of these NES cartridges. And, I was just like, oh my God. And so I bought as many as I possibly could off of her just to, and they were like in great condition. It was like just amazing. So just one of those weird things. And then I got in the car and I called Kelsey, who owns Pink Gorilla Games. It's a local retro gaming store. I'm like, Kelsey, I told this lady to bring all the rest of her stuff that I couldn't buy. Don't burn it, but I told her to bring it into your store. So just be aware if this lady comes in with this massive amounts of games, that's who I'm, So yeah, I tried to save as much as I could.
I'm just imagining all these copies of stadium events burning away on like this fire and you just watching.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that because, the reason why stadium events and the NWC carts and stuff like that get found here is because there's so many Nintendo employees here, right? And again, sometimes they think they're worthless. They don't, for them it was a job. It was just, a product that they're selling or whatever. And so yeah, those things are here. It's pretty crazy.
Well, one thing I really like is your pickup videos as well. So your big box PC one with Kenzie was great because you could kind of look through all the old titles, and the giant Pikachu with Kelsey as well. I was wondering, would you be doing any more pickup videos?
Well, that big box PC pickup was very unique. That was a crazy thing because what had happened is that I'd gone over off Craigslist a guy who worked at Microsoft or still works there, and he was selling a bunch of big box PC stuff. His garage was full of it. He let me pick through it. Kind of made a friend in him, and I told him, like, hey man, if you ever run into any more of the stuff or you want to sell any duplicates, let me know. And about a week later, he messages me. He's like, hey, have you seen this ad on Craigslist? He's like, it's been up for about a week. And so I look on there and I'm like, 600 big box PC games. And again, I'm looking, so many times that when people say big box PC, they either mean the DVD size, which are the ones from the 2000s, or it's just the jewel cases or whatever. They don't really know, right? And I look at that ad, I'm like, holy crap, this looks amazing, right? And the thing is, it was over in Bremerton, which is a ferry ride. So you have to be committed to do this. Anyway, so I messaged the guy. I'm like, hey, I'm really interested. And he's like, okay, but you got to get over here because if you don't, it's been up for a week or so, and I'm just going to take it all to the charity shop, the Goodwill. So he was tired of getting jerked around by people who were kind of interested. Because if you think about it, most people don't have the space to take on that, and he wanted everything gone. So I was like, oh, okay. So it's funny. I messaged Kinsey. I'm like, Kinsey, like it's a Tuesday or whatever. I'm like, hey, you got to go with me. And she's like, I'm working. I'm like, call in sick. I need some help. And she was actually really cool. So she called in sick. Her boss still doesn't know. And Yeah, we hopped on a boat. We went over there, and it's funny because we thought we could put it all into our SUV, and no way. Like, it was so much stuff, and it was all awesome too. And the guy was really interesting because he, you know, I when I do that, I'm shooting video. I'm like, hey, you know, I talked to him first. I'm like, just so you know, I have a YouTube channel. This is a pretty cool thing. This is kind of what I do. I'd like to be able to shoot video if possible. And he was like, no. I was like, oh. I'm like, and I get it. You know, he wants to be private. He's like, no, I forget what he said. He's basically in military intelligence. I was like, oh, because Bremerton is a big military town. He's like, basically, you can only shoot around the street and in my walkway, but you can't show the front of my house or the number. I was like, okay, that's totally cool, dude. We'll do whatever we can. But that's why in that video we drive over to the park, and that's when I actually show the majority of what was in the back of it. And then he promised me to come back the next day. That's when I got Paul, and we actually got a bigger SUV to get all the rest of it. And it was an awesome, crazy find. You just don't have those very often. What's amazing about him too is that I didn't say this in this video, but that was only one of his collections. So he also has a massive PlayStation 1, NES, Super NES. I mean, all that stuff. He just wanted to get rid of the PC stuff.
Well, you know, talking about amazing pickups, obviously the video that, you know, a lot of people will have seen of yours as a golden kind of pickup, something that you don't see very often, was the American version of the N64DD. Now, just so you know, if anyone hasn't seen it, kind of tell us a bit about that and how you came across it.
Yeah, so it was really interesting find. So, and you know, to all your listeners, I just have to be kind of like my video. I have to be a little bit careful about this because the person who I got that from doesn't want to be identified, and they don't want to be identified for the reasons why I say in the videos, because use your imagination, but there's a lot of people who work at a lot of different gaming companies, and even though Seattle's a big city, they all know each other, and so they just don't want to be. They don't need the limelight. But anyway, so that was another thing where, again, Craigslist, someone was posting on Craigslist a bunch of import games, and it was over on the east side of Puget Sound, so it's a little bit of a drive, about 30 minutes. But I drove over there, and it's like, this person shows me their game room, and it's like all this really crazy import stuff. I think at that time I actually took Reggie with me, and meeting this person for the first time, they've got a bunch of really unusual stuff, and we bought a ton of it that night. And then they pointed to this milk crate that was sitting underneath their desk. They'd just been kind of kicking with their feet, and they're like, "Yeah, I've got this thing," and didn't know what it was. It had that kind of like test unit stuff on there, and didn't maybe one day we'll figure out what this thing was. And so that's exactly what happened, was that it took about 2 years for that person to kind of trust me. Basically, I was like, I really, I don't know what this thing is either, but I'd love to do a video on it. Let's see what happens. And they were like, I don't really care. They're going on with their life. And then about 2 years later, they're finally like, yeah, okay, let's just see what this thing is. And so what happened was, though, what that video is crazy, is that I posted on assemblergames.com, I think is what it was. It basically a very famous site for people who really dig deep into the hardware and software of retro games and stuff like that. Anyways, and so created an account on there, posted some photos of it, and was like, hey, does anybody know what this thing is? And it immediately, people were like, oh, that is the unreleased US prototype of the N64DD disk drive. And what was really interesting about it is that it boots up in English. So the entire operating system has been converted over to English. Anyways, and so that video kind of went viral on its own. It was really kind of crazy because it got picked up by Ars Technica and some other ones, and it just sort of ran with it. It actually helped me out because it helped me identify what it was. And then it turned me on to people who were able to kind of test a little bit with it. So there's a guy, Tony, hit a YouTube channel called Hard for Games, and he's a bit of a prototype collector. And so he flew over to Seattle, and kind of help me figure out exactly what's going on with it. Now, here's the really weird thing about it is that it's near production ready, meaning it has all the copyright built into it and it's region locked. So it's a US 64DD, but it'll only play US 64DD games, of which there are none. So in other words, Japanese ones won't play on it by default. So the only thing that will really run on it is that demo disc that was inside the drive when it left Nintendo.
It's strange because we saw a lot of hype in England about the DD, and we'd see it in magazines and stuff, but was it ever successful in Japan?
I don't get the sense it was. I think, because only, 10 titles came out for it, and 4 of those are kind of like, paint and kind of educational titles. And at that time, when that came out, I forget exactly when, but, it was so, I think floppy disk was over. Floppy disk was kind of over on the PC. People had moved on to CDs at that point. So it's the technology of floppy disks. Like it was too little too late, in my opinion.
Well, have you ever done like a teardown of the system, or would you let, someone like, Ben Heck, for example, kind of dig into it and have a look?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think somebody reached out to me who wanted to do that. I probably could do an update video on that. That's the thing is that people ask me, it's like, so my main goal with that really is to be like, hey, are there any more of these blue discs out there? Because everyone knows that Mother 3 was in development. There's all these games that could have potentially come out for the US version of the 64DD. Are there any prototype in development games out there, these blue discs? And 4 of them came forward, I think, and all of them were either damaged or blank. So anyways, to answer your question about tearing it down, potentially, but really I thought the games was going to be the big thing for that. I was like, man, it'd be so cool if there's a playable version of, Mother 3 that I can pop in there and, at least bring up the title screen. That would have been so cool. But those blue discs, those developer discs are incredibly rare. If they're sitting around somewhere, they're in a drawer or an attic, and people have long forgotten about them.
Talking of things like, like the N64DD that you got, is there any other kind of dream hardware or prototype, something that you've always kind of keeping an eye out for or you'd love to get?
Not really. I don't really honestly spend that much time thinking about it. A friend of mine who works at Microsoft bought a Super Nintendo development kit unit. Basically, it looks like a PC, but it's branded Nintendo and Super Nintendo, and it has ports on the front for the controllers and stuff. And so I've been bugging him to do a video on that. It's already out there. People have seen it if they look for it, but he actually owns it, and it works. The one thing, in order to get that to work, though, it only works with Windows 3.1. So you have to have a PC and you can't fake it because it's doing a serial port. So he's been kind of dragging his feet going, I don't want to build a Windows 3.1 machine, and be like, I'll build one. I'll do it. It'd be really cool. Let's trying to think. I think Casey has a couple. Casey is a big collector in our area. I think he's got a couple prototype machines, but it's not something that I really think that much about or follow, to be honest. Obviously the Super Nintendo CD, the PlayStation Super Nintendo was a really cool find. I don't know if you've ever actually seen that in person, but that travels around to a bunch of the expos here in the US, and that's pretty cool. And it was cool that Ben Heck was able to get that thing working.
Yeah, Ravi had heard a rumor there might be a few more out there as well.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing about this is that usually there are. The problem is that as time goes on, they just get thrown away. Like that guy over in Bremerton. I know that's PC games, but it just gets thrown away. People either don't know what it is, or they're cleaning the house or moving, someone dies, that sort of stuff.
Well, the one thing I love about your channel, like you said, you can't be an expert on everything, so you bring other people in, and now you've formed like a Metal Jesus crew. Are you planning on doing more kind of collaborative videos with more people in them? Because I love the one where you went out gaming and you had that, you'd hired that kind of cottage out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah, that was really, I know, man, that was a beautiful place to stay. Yeah, I'm always interested in having people over. That's my favorite videos to do. It's great to have a conversation. It's great I love it. It's it's easier for me because I don't have to say every single word. I don't have to, I don't know. I just love the conversation. So anyways, John Riggs is going to be on a video here pretty soon. He's all about PlayStation VR. And so he did a PlayStation VR Hidden Gems video that's actually uploaded to YouTube now and just waiting to go. A friend of mine down in Portland, Oregon is coming up next weekend. His name's Andrew, and we're going to do a bunch of music stuff. We're probably going to, I think for that one, we're actually going to go, and we've also got a bunch of record stores in Seattle. And so we're going to hit up a bunch of those and do some vinyl kind of hunting, stuff like that. So it's always ongoing. But also, to your point, I'm always interested in other people as well. Like, I've actually had quite a few people beyond just the core, people that I've had on. The problem is that people, it looks easy to do what we do. And it is for us because we're used to talking to an invisible audience. But often when people be like, hey, I want to come on your channel and stuff like that. And they find that it's really weird to sit there and talk to this pretend audience on camera. And so that's something you kind of have to get used to doing, So every once in a while I want to bring somebody on who's like doing stuff like that. And I'm certainly interested in doing it, especially if they bring something new and interesting to into videos or a conversation. But it's not as easy as it looks.
I mean, you also do get out and, speak to real life audiences as well. I mean, have you got any kind of conventions or events that you're going to be going to over the summer?
Yeah. It's expos are awesome. They're really fun. And so I'm going to be going to, let me see here. So the next one I'm going to be going to is E3. That'll be in June. That's in LA. And then after that, I'm going to be going to Game On Expo, which is a really awesome expo down in Phoenix, Arizona. And that's in August. September, I will be going to PAX West, which is right here in Seattle. So that's really easy for me. I think I'm going to be doing a panel with somebody. I don't know. And then after that, it's going to be the big Portland Retro Gaming Expo in October. That one is, you couldn't keep me away from that one. That one's the awesome one.
Well, if we ever make it out to one of those, it would be awesome to meet up. Like Ravi and I are big fans of your channel, and it's been great getting your stories this week as well about Sierra and your YouTube channel and all these amazing discoveries. And thank you for coming on. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm a new fan of your channel. I loved, the Firebird video that you did. It was so fascinating because here in the US, we had Elite and we had a few of these games, but I had no idea about the connection between Firebird and Rainbird and all of that stuff. That was a great episode. So I'm a new subscriber to your podcast.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, that's such a weird one as well, that it was British Telecom and the Post Office. And that's one great thing about retro gaming, though, isn't it? Just discovering all these weird stories that you didn't know existed. And
oh, yeah. And if you start digging into PC games, I mean, it's an endless supply of stuff, as you guys know. It's like, Sierra was the big one, or one of the big ones, but there's all these little ones that created little masterpieces that I just love hearing about. So it's cool. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.